Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Namaskarams to revered Shri Sadguru Ma, Swami Sri Hari Prasad, Professor Pannir Selvam, Professor Francis Clooney, devotees and friends. The Vishnu Mohan Foundation has organized this two-day seminar on Sri Ramanujar, the Vedantin social philosopher of the 11th century. It is an honor and a privilege to be here with you today in this inaugural function and share my thoughts on Sri Ramanuja in the context of value-based leadership. Sri Ramanuja propagated bhakti and prapatti and was one of the foremost exponents of the Sri Vaishnavite tradition. Yati Raja, the king among monks as he was known, was an acharya, reformer, revolutionary, philosopher, and above all, an excellent administrator. The extent of his relevance, even after a millennium, is quite evident from society's ongoing preoccupation with his work, as showcased through lectures, publications, exhibitions, discourses. In fact, an article in today's edition of the Times of India newspaper, and of course, this forum. As Sri Ramanuja progressively redefined some of the tenets of Hinduism, he also contributed to the welfare of the downtrodden, perhaps by defying tradition, if need be. A progenitor of the neo-Vedantists of modern India Renaissance, he inspired others like Swami Vivekananda, who were perhaps of a similar mold. He rejuvenated Vedic culture at a time when successive invaders committed themselves to the destruction of the fabric that held us all together, namely religion and culture. I will attempt to tease out a few generic leadership insights from a value-based context. I think I will have to state a disclaimer here. It's somewhat like attempting to explain the magnificence of the Pacific Ocean based on an examination of a few drops. But that's the reality for me. The first was Sri Ramanuja's undoubted authenticity. As an impressionable young student of Yadava Prakasha, he was pressing the feet of his master who explained the verse of the Chandogya Upanishad. When he heard what he felt to be a disrespectful interpretation of a verse, tears rolled down his cheeks and fell on his guru's feet. When asked, he did not hesitate to say that the reference was uncomplimentary to the divine. This in an era of the Guru Parampara, where the Guru was worshipped as an embodiment of Brahma, Vishnu, and Maheshwara. Inclusiveness. The formulators of ancient Indian society probably pioneered the concept of functional specialization. Their objective was for a balanced societal structure with multiple parts complementing each other, which nourished and enhanced society culturally, spiritually, and economically. However, there were periods of social misalignment created by tectonic shifts in the economic and/or physical power of specific communities or classes that needed realignment. Such was it during Sri Ramanuja's time when birth became a birthright, a benchmark for status, access to learning, and other entitlements that we take for granted today. However, events in his life demonstrated his view of Purnatvam, the holistic view, the integral view that Dr. Pannir Selvam just referred to, where such differences were irrelevant, and how Sri Ramanuja led by example to set the balance right. Of course, the way he managed Tirukoshtiyur Nambi stands out. It took him 18 visits to receive the Tirumandiram, and that too came at a price, that he would invoke the divine wrath if he ever compromised on secrecy. Soon thereafter, Sri Ramanuja climbed atop the gopuram of the temple and called out to share the mantram. Of course, his guru was upset and cursed Ramanuja. Undaunted, the saint replied that he was willing to undergo any punishment if the mantram offered salvation to many. He also coined the word Tirukulathar, that is, the one who is born in the family of Lakshmi. Also, he would keep his hand on the shoulder of his disciple Dhanurdas soon after his bath. That was his way to convey the need to eradicate untouchability. Coming to influence and tact, when Sri Ramanuja was appointed as the head of the Srirangam temple, and on multiple occasions he encountered hostility, including attempts on his life. He was undaunted. Modern leadership research attests to the sustainability of influence and tact over authority. Sri Ramanuja exercises abundantly in winning over influential stakeholders and devotees. In one instance, he had concerns over Amudanar's conduct as administrator of the Srirangam temple, and he realized fairly quickly that enforcement of authority was probably a suboptimal option. When Amundanar approached Sri Ramanuja to suggest an evolved Sri Vaishnava to attend a feast on the 11th day after his mother's demise, Sri Ramanuja suggested Arvan's name. After the feast, as was the custom, Amundanar asked Arvan whether everything was all right. Arvan responded that he would be satisfied only if the keys to the temple were handed over to Sri Ramanuja. Thus, tact was used and Sri Ramanuja took over as the religious and administrative head of the temple. Over time, he involved Arvan in the Ayyappa recital as part of the temple's Kainkariams as well. Eventually, this was a win-win for all concerned. Let me come to openness. The Anantapa Padmanabha Swami temple in Thiruvananthapuram was administered in a manner that was at variance with the Agama-based approach advocated by Sri Ramanuja. He sensed that the local community who served in the temple were uncomfortable with his preference. An active believer and espouser of Purnatvam, he ratified their approach. This safeguarded the livelihoods of many who depended upon the temple for their livelihood and earned their loyalty in the process. Another aspect of openness was in the way he engaged with worshippers. He lived in Sriperumbudur during interesting times. Sanskrit was a primary language for students of esoteric concepts such as Jivatma and Paramatma, many of which may have been too intellectual and therefore elusive for the layperson. Thanks to the Arvars, there was an abundance of religious hymns in Tamil in the Bhakti tradition, where simplicity was the underlying mode. This may have had the potential to create opposing communities for whom either Tamil or Sanskrit was a language of comfort. However, Sri Ramanuja actively encouraged both traditions and created harmony. Likewise, he understood that music too was a medium for many and actively supported musicians and dancers. Now you can imagine a typical day in the temple precinct. An intellectual discussion in one of the mandapams, the priests and the devotees chanting the Nalayana Divya Prabandham in another mandapam, while dancers and musicians performed in a third mandapam. Profound expressions of bhakti all round. Coming to governance, one of his significant contributions was the standardization of processes for temple worship. He brought about reforms progressively in the Vaishnava temples that he gained control over, and to this day, his meticulous instructions are the norm for Sri Vaishnava temples. For the benefit of devotees, he devised the Nitya Grantham, a manual to help them with their Nitya Karmas. Besides developing theories and publishing philosophical works, he set up centers of studies for his philosophy all over India. These influenced generations of poets and saints devoted to the Bhakti movement. At a time when temples were considered to be places of worship for man to attain the divine, Sri Ramanuja wondered whether temples could establish the life divine for man in those very places. Accordingly, at Srirangam, he moved away from the established practice of appointing supervisors on the basis of community. He created groups of servitors to manage different activities within the temple, including potters, washermen, temple dancers, bellsmiths, cowherds, musicians, sculptors, farmers, boatmen, tailors, and pipers. To feed pilgrims, massive storage bins were created. A herbal garden was established. While cooks prepared prasadam for devotees, horticulturists tended to the gardens for sourcing the daily garlands. Washermen looked after the garments to drape the deities, and cowherds maintained goshalas for supplying milk, ghee, and curd for the temple. Where needed, roads were freshly laid or widened to provide access to devotees, and adequate tanks were constructed to ensure copious water supply all round the year. The Acharya encouraged the involvement of people from all strata in aspects of temple administration and ensured that all were honored and recognized appropriately. This included personal access to the deities too. The executive officer was the Vicharanakarta, and a mutt was created for the Jier in charge of temple properties. To draw upon the contemporary cliche of sustainability, all these structures and processes continue even today. Humility. The sheer number of gurus that Sri Ramanuja had validates this. Periya Nambi, Thirumalai Nambi, Tirukoshtiyur Nambi, Tirukatchi Nambi, just to name a few, and many more. In fact, there is a thin line of separation between his gurus and devotees. Some were even interchangeable, depending on the context. He did not discriminate based on one's societal status. His approach to learning from Tirukatchi Nambi stands testimony to this. As Sri Ramanuja was from a higher caste, Tirukatchi Nambi refused to be his guru. However, Sri Ramanuja persisted. In a lighter vein, I mentioned humility, an English word to describe one aspect of the saint. However, the cornerstone of Sri Ramanuja's philosophy, Sharanagati, is impossible to translate in English. I will therefore have to do Sharanagati to that. Regularly, Sri Ramanuja noticed a group of children who built sand temples of Lord Ranganatha, installed a toy idol of the Lord, and offered sand and mud as if they were offering fruit and flowers. Once, the children were celebrating Egadeshi Utsavam, and they called out to him, inviting him to join their worship. Sri Ramanuja immediately prostrated before the sand temple. The children were delighted. They recited shlokas as done in the Srirangam temple, and people gathered. Later, the children offered Tirtha Prasadam and Tulsi leaves to everyone gathered and blessed everyone with Sri Shatari. Sri Ramanuja accepted everything with grace, with complete bhakti and Sharanagati. This incident illustrates the essential quality of a Bhagavata who reveres Bhagavan and Bhagavatas and sees Bhagavan in everyone, including fellow Bhagavatas. To end on a personal note, I come from a family where bhakti and a strong devotion to the poet saint Andal is a moving force. Andal and her Tirupavai are both extremely dear to me. In fact, Margazhi is the most beloved month, of course, for more reasons than just the cool Chennai weather. Relatively cool, or maybe cooler. I am often reminded of an incident from Sri Ramanuja's life when he was chanting the Tirupavai. One day, he was going from door to door reciting Tirupavai, as was his practice while collecting bhiksha for his one meal of the day in Tirukoshtiyur. As he reached the door of his Acharya, Tirukoshtiyur Nambi, he was reciting the Pasuram. Undu Mada Kalitran Vodada Tolvalian Nandagopan Marmagale Nappinai Gandam Kamarum Korili Kadai Tiravai Bandi Engum Kori Adaitanakan Madhavi Pandal Mel Palkal Kuilanangal Kovinakan Pandar Viraliun Maithunan Perpada. And as he chanted, Sendamare Kayyar Sirar Valayolippa Vandu Tiraval Magundelo Embavai. Athurai Pirati, the daughter of Ramanuja's Acharya, opened the door with her bangles jangling. This extraordinary coincidence made Ramanuja faint, and he felt that it was Nappinai Pirati herself opening the door. Such was his reverence for Andal and Tirupavai. Indeed, this aspect of Sri Ramanuja was the first thing that came to my mind when I was asked to deliver this welcome address. Such a complete immersion in bhakti is certainly worthy of emulation. I sum up with the profound realization that the humaneness, openness, inclusivity, the venerability, compassion and governance, including the conciliatory abilities, some of the traits of Sri Ramanuja that I referred to are relevant and inspirational even today. As we comprehend a continuous metamorphosis in society, we do need Sri Ramanuja's ideals to blend the constant interweaving of material progress with spirituality. The paths may differ, but Sharanagati is common. Before I conclude, I must admit that the cadence of my journey towards Sri Ramanuja was enormously influenced by an interaction with Dr. Indira Parthasarthi, facilitated by Sri Kumarji. I must also acknowledge that I learned from the writings of Dr. Prema Nandakumar, Dr. Madhusudanan Kalai Chelvan. I also listened to Professor Clooney's address given at the Vedanta Society, New York. Please accept my sincere gratitude for this opportunity to attend this auspicious occasion today. My humble prayers for the success of this seminar. Namaskaram.
We extend our heartfelt gratitude to Sri Mohan Venkatesan, Senior Vice President and Head of Sundaram Finance, for his enlightening inaugural address. We thank him for introducing us to Sharanagati and how Ramanuja improvised the running administration of the Sri Vaishnava temples and the other events of his life. I now invite with great honor and reverence Swami Sri Hari Prasad Ji, founder and managing trustee of SVMF, to deliver the Anugraha Bhashyam.
Narayana, Narayana, Narayana. Sri Sadguruma's grace, and because of her, the foundation has had 4 programs on Vishnu Advaitha, which I don't think any other Advaita has done earlier. So, Sadhguru was always very open to the other darshanas, even though she was an Advaitan. She was very clear she is an Advaitan, but she was open to all darshanas. And she used to say also, if you ask Krishna, if you ask me if Krishna is Advaitan, I'd say yes. If you ask me if he's a Vishnu Advaitan, I'd say yes. If you ask me if he's Advaitan, I'll say yes. Because all these viewpoints have been given their Shakti by him. It is all, he is Ananta, beyond, without an end. So therefore, we cannot put Brahman in any category. All these viewpoints are different ways of looking at the same reality. That's what Sadhguru said. Different. It's like a mountain. From one side will look rocky, one side will look green, like that. Various viewpoints are there, and all are to be honored. And for Sadhguru, the most wonderful thing about Sri Ramanuja was, more than his insistence on Sharanagati, which appealed so much to her, was his great heart. So I remember as a boy, when we went to Tirugoshtiyur, the temple was closed, but then she showed us the Gopuram and said about how he went and he proclaimed the Narayana mantra to everyone. So he took, because by the time he had come, the stratification of and the calcification of Indian society had started. So he tried to fight that by giving Vishnu Bhakti to everyone. To all levels of society he gave Vishnu Bhakti. And he and all the great Vishnu Advaitins at that time saw no difference between any person and person. Always they saw that Mahavishnu was there in everyone. And they practiced that and they lived their lives like that. So there was an issue because Periyanambi cremated a Harijan, but that didn't stop him from doing these things. He continued to be how he was. So maybe if his philosophy had been taken all over India, we would have had less difficulties with caste as we have today. But like I said always, we must go back for the solutions for our problems. We must go back to the Vedas. We must go back to Bhakti and to Samadrishti for anything to be settled. So many reform movements have come in Hindu Dharma. Each one is appropriate for their time. And then there would be a time for calm, and then again another wave would arise. And this is probably the biggest wave in that ocean of Hindu Dharma that covered the whole of the south and spread Vishnu Bhakti as a panacea for all troubles and all difficulties. May we all follow that lead. Shri Sadguru Arpanamastu, Shri Krishna Arpanamastu, Narayana Narayana.
A guiding light on our spiritual journey and for blessing us with your divine wisdom. We now have the book ceremony. Swami Shri Hari Prasad Ji will be presenting Dr. Indra Parthasathi's a significant book on Ramanuja. It's with great respect that we have Professor Francis Clooney, a distinguished scholar in the field of divinity and comparative theology, a renowned educator at Harvard Divinity School, to deliver the keynote address and enrich our seminar with his valuable wisdom and scholarly perspective. He is a PhD from the University of Chicago. Primary areas of Indological scholarship are theological commentarial writings in the Sanskritam and Tamil traditions of Sri Vaishnavism. He is a leading figure globally in the developing field of comparative theology. He has many books and papers to his credit, like Reading the Hindu and Christian Classics, Why and How It Matters, Western Jewish scholars in India, Tracing Their Paths, Reassessing Their Goals, which are very popular. His translation of Ramanuja's Nitya Grantham is well received. He is currently writing his autobiography, Priest and Scholar, Catholic and Hindu, a love story. I now request Father Clooney to give the keynote address.